Okay, well, appreciate Adam and Ola and everybody at 1080. So, yep, I'm Kyle Sammons. Today I'll be giving you guys the overview of the holistic base Achilles tendon return to play that we used at University of Washington. We had two guys, which we'll dive into especially and specifically. But first things first, this has been a giant team that put this thing together. It wasn't just me. We had a lot of people on board here. So I had an assistant underneath myself, Aaron Sanchez, who him and I daily had these conversations about what to do, how to attack it. So there's a lot of information. It's a very complex topic. I still struggle putting this all together because there's so much data. But at the end of the day, we're going to go through why we did it, the roadmap, and then the results that we got, which let's get into it. So first things first, the vision. Why do Achilles ruptures happen? Why do injuries happen? There's a lot of unknown, but that's the first layer. We want to just understand, why did we have two Achilles ruptures? What took place? Let's dive into it, learn more. I'll be honest, I didn't have any Achilles ruptures in my 15 years until these two happened about 5 days apart from each other. So we started there. And the second piece that we dove into is neurology unlocking the gate. So now we're looking at threat mechanisms, but how you integrate sensory information through the actual brain, and then you get motor outputs, which has a big piece of this too. So yeah, something happened at the soft tissue, but it was a system that broke down. And then understanding the muscle tendon unit just deeper. We kind of understand what it does and how it can transmit force and be very, very, very powerful with the elastic components. But this was also too something we just want to dive into deeper and uncover all these rocks, just to make sure we're doing our end and doing our work to make sure that these athletes came back healthier and exceeded where they were previously. And then the timeline, looking at capacity, competency, and strengths. We use that as our timeline. We had day in and day out meetings with our medical staff. So this was a giant holistic process because I was in meetings every single day, talking to the medical staff, interacting with the surgeons, and they'd ask questions, we'd ask questions. But at the end of the day, this is a giant process that we used across all lines of strength conditioning and med staff. And I was kind of in the middle, bridging that gap, looking at return to play as more or less a return to play specialist, and loading tissue. And then frequency versus volume. We looked at both of these as well, and we'll get into what we did and how we did it and why we did it. And essentially frequency is a big piece of frequency and how important that is. But at the very end, all of these things, you'll hear me say a lot, is principles are greater than methods. If you understand the principles and you understand why things are being done, the why is very important, it's very strong. And then you can apply methods. I think a lot of times this gets switched around, where people apply methods without understanding true principles. So having the grounding of the principles first is what we wanted to kind of build this foundation on. Okay, getting into the injuries. These are two catastrophic injuries that we didn't enjoy having, but the blessing in disguise was we got to learn from it. We got to get a lot better as practitioners, but also to look at maybe some of our blind spots. So we had two different athletes. And what I mean by that is they played two different positions. One was a big skill, and then one was another big skill, but they're playing, one's an outside linebacker and one's a middle linebacker. So one was coming off the edge, whereas one is in space more. And it was two different Achilles injuries. One was a mid-tendon rupture. So whenever I mention athlete one, that's the mid-tendon rupture athlete. And whenever I mention athlete two, that's the avulsion. So the mid-tendon is definitely, pretty big rupture. The avulsion is also a different one where it rips off the bone. But why I'm saying this is because we had two different ruptures, but yet the process we used to get these guys back, they followed a similar timeline and they both came back at the exact same time. And then the last piece of just this slide is injuries occur when the capacity of the weakest link in the lower limb is exceeded. That's really important. So that's going to point us to the distal areas of our endpoints and making sure that those distal endpoints can actually attenuate force, produce force, but also to transmit force. A lot of times I think we go proximal to distal, whereas we went distal to proximal. Mechanisms of Achilles ruptures and why do they take place? This is kind of where we started. We dove into research and we just talked daily about why this happened. Usually Achilles ruptures based off this research that we looked at is coming off of an acceleration deceleration action or a violent dorsiflexion. So as we can see here, 53% of the ruptures occur with a push off, 17% with sudden and unexpected dorsiflexion, and then 10% violent dorsiflexion or plantar flex of a plantar flexed foot. So why that's important is because, once again, this is looking at the distal endpoints. You need to make sure that you're strong in plantar flexion, you're strong in dorsiflexion. The main one, though, is plantar flexion. That leads us into having weak plantar flexors. Forces are encountered anywhere from 6 to 12 times body weight when you're sprinting. And so that's really, really key to know, because that's the end game we want to get back to. We want to get these guys sprinting, jumping, change directions, not where they were, but beyond that. So we're exceeding the previous capacities. That's true athletic performance in my eyes. Looking at return to play, kind of the outlook of return to play and what's at play here. And we just wanted to see what was the time frame, what is the average, and how can we either match that or somehow get it better, in a sense, exceed that return to play timeline through understanding actual neural capacities and the morphological, the muscles, and their actual strength capacities and competencies. And so what we looked at was a systematic review. It was 15 studies of very high level NBA, NFL, MLB professional leagues, and 76% of the athletes returned, but it was with a decreased performance and durability. That's really key to know, is that's a lot of people returning, but it's not getting to where the level they were at or exceeding it. And we wanted to make sure we were exceeding it, because if we got them back to where they were previously, the chance of getting injured again is probably going to go up. So the average time frame of an Achilles return to play from surgery to playing in their first game was 11 months. And so we looked at that and we're like, okay, cool, we got our work cut out for us. However, we'll take you through the framework that we built and what we did as a whole team. And lo and behold, our framework actually exceeded that. We got both those guys back from data surgery to playing their first game at 6 months. And the way we did it wasn't being negligent, wasn't being, going rogue. It was just making sure we knew what we were doing and having neural capacities and competencies as the layer. And then we're building on top of that with the actual function of the muscle, but the tendon. Now we're getting more into our approach and kind of what we talked about, neurology. And it's a very, very zoomed out approach here. In a sense, this is a very simplistic view. And this is a great graph looking at it. In a sense, you get sensory input, which is numerous things. That's proprioceptive, that's tactile, that's visual. So all of these things come into play through our receptors, whether our feet, hands, eyes, or skin, and then we integrate it, and then we have motor output. And motor output can be directly tied to how we integrate sensory information. And so just because we fall in love with the motor output and the high jumps, fast speed, stuff of that nature, we can't overlook the actual sensory information coming in. And so we used approach every single day in our warm-up. That was 6 exercises that we went through, just different joint actions isometrically. So it's MVIC. And what we're trying to do is get the brain to understand, hey, these ranges of motions are okay, and let's drive some force through them. And we'll take you through the progression here in a little bit. But at the end of the day, if we don't have optimal sensory input, in a sense, our feet are very sensitive. We don't understand when our foot hits the floor. That's all information coming back. Feed forward feedback is really important. And if we can't integrate that, we're going to have a suboptimal motor output. That means they're not going to be recovering very quickly, or they're going to have pain, or they're not going to jump very high or sprint very fast. So what we did is we built rock mats. We have the Achilles guys come in and actually sit down first, because they were non-weight bearing, but they would just rub their feet. And obviously one side's more sensitive. So all it's telling you is we need to pay attention to that side. And so what we did every single day, we used the rock mat, and we also use a spike ball for both our guys, just to increase the sensory input, which is going to increase the integration and then increase our motor output. So we always started there with our warm-ups, and then we actually bled this into our workouts as well. But just wanted to make sure we layered that in. Now we're getting into the actual mechanical properties of muscles. And this is another big piece that we looked at too. So on the left is you're just looking at one muscle and how it functions, in a sense, length to shortening. And we do know that we're about 40% stronger and even higher than 40%, depending on age and gender, than an isometric contraction or even a concentric action. So why that's important is we started to overload in certain areas eccentrically, just because we're stronger, and that's going to drag up then our concentric. But also too, it's understanding the deceleration component first. And then once we looked at just muscles, then we go into actual multi-joint movements. And so now what this is looking on the far right graph is just there's a linear approach with load and acceleration essentially, or velocity, hypothetically speaking, that less load, higher speeds, more load, slower speeds. And so there's two of those pieces at play here, which we'll get into even deeper about how it affects the tendon. Now we're getting into the muscle tendon unit and implications of force and velocity. So looking at force on the left-hand side in the yellow box, and you're looking at velocity on the right-hand side in the blue box. And so first we'll go over force. And so this is a hypothetical just force velocity profile, just stating that higher force, lower velocity, here's what it's going to do to the muscle tendon as a whole. You're going to increase force capabilities. The limb speeds are slower. That's because of mechanical load on the frame. You're increasing the cross-sectional area of the muscle because of the heavier load on the frame and the slower limb speeds. So you're always keeping intense and velocity at the same if you can, but the weight on your frame is just going to adjust how you move the bar or what's going on. Tendon thickness increases. So that's another big piece here. It's going to get thicker, closer to the bone, and you're also going to increase tendon compliance closer to where the muscle attaches into the tendon. And so it's going to become less stiff, which I think is important early on coming off of surgery. Tendons can be really stiff. And not only that, doing force, higher force movements early on is going to help remodel that tendon. There isn't a time constraint. Time is out the window. That's where force comes into play. As you're driving something as hard as you can, sometimes it can take, seconds up to 30 seconds, which we'll get into how we did that. And then velocity, hypothetical velocity profile, low force, higher velocity is just increasing the velocity capacities. That's a faster limb speed. Why is that important? Because now the eccentric demands pick up. It increases sarcomeres and series. So that's looking at eccentrics, fast eccentrics, sprinting, and what it does to the actual soft tissue. It increases shortening velocity. It decreases tendon compliance. So it actually makes your tendons more stiff. So looking at these two pieces here, we need to know this is important, that one is going to increase thickness and be less compliant, and one is going to actually make the tendon less compliant, more stiff. So less stiff, more stiff. And then there is a giant time constraint with velocity. In a sense, it's seconds or less into milliseconds. And that's really important to know because that's going to affect our nervous system very differently. You're looking at conscious versus subconscious hypothetically, where it's just reflexive. And the last piece here is there's a clear linear relationship with velocity of movement where the eccentric concentric ratio increased by 0.2% for every 1 degree of second in velocity. So all that's saying is as our limb speeds pick up, the velocity of the movement picks up, the demands eccentrically start to pick up. So that's kind of really important to understand why we started with doing ISOs and eccentrics and supramaxillary eccentrics and then eccentric quasi-isometrics. This is just looking at the frequency piece and why we went frequency over volume. Looking at this on the left, this is some research coming out of 2012 by Paxton. And all this is looking at just a high level approach is what does frequency do to collagen when they took these engineered ligaments and tendons and just stretched them essentially at different frequencies, at different time points and different durations. And what we see here is these two on the far right have significant differences than the other two loading strategies. And the one on the left that's got the higher bars looking at that, they only stretched it at a 0.5 hertz essentially, which is just a slower frequency for 10 minutes. And then the other one was a little bit faster frequency for 5 minutes. And why that's important is because they did that and then they rested. And there's different time intervals when they rested. It went anywhere from 30 minutes all the way to 24 hours. And what they saw was anything before 6 hours in this stretching protocol, it actually, the collagen became less responsive. So the remodeling became less responsive in the tendons and the muscle tendon unit itself. So that's really important to know because you load something, take 6 hours off, reload it, you can actually hypothetically speed up the recovery process. This is now looking at Van Loon's work, 2019, and this is a really important piece that we looked at as well. And all we want to look at here is just the protein synthesis rates of the different tissues. And you're looking at soft tissue, so muscle, and then you're looking at bone, and then you're looking at tendon ligaments. And what we can see here is what do the protein synthesis rates look like for the vastus lateralis, so soft tissue, compared to the bone and the tendon ligaments? And we always have this hypothesis, and we do know that bone does take longer to remodel. I mean, research does show that it does take longer. And then we also sit there and say that, sometimes our soft tissue, AKA the collagen fibers, can take longer. And so we wanted to understand, could we increase our turnover rate, in a sense, like how we load our tissue to get guys back faster? So frequency plus intensity, will that help essentially our Achilles guys? And what we want to just point to here is the vastus lateralis in the far left is at 0.05% per hour protein turnover or synthesis rate. So this just shows how frequently we're turning over our soft tissue. But lo and behold, the patellar tendon and the ACL, they actually are at the same level or exceeding the turnover rate of the vastus lateralis. So that's important to know, that if we use frequency where we don't overload it and blow the athlete out of the water, and then if we use protein and collagen after we actually stress the tissue, what that can do then is actually build it back quicker, stronger, thicker, and now we'll get into that. Now we're going back into the neural framework here and kind of what we put together after we got through the science here. Now we're going to just start layering down the framework of what we did, and just tying back in the force velocity relationship that we went over, looking at eccentric strength, isometric strength, and concentric strength. That laid the groundwork for what we did. And so the first things, looking at isometrics, that was always the barrier of entry. Why? Because our limb speeds are so slow, or not moving at all. And so it increases our neuromuscular coordination, firing those muscles, and that's the neural drive component. Increases force capacities at different joint angles. So that could be at different joint positions you want to work, whether it's a mechanical advantage or disadvantage. Increasing tendon remodeling, that's through the stress relaxation principle. So holding something for 30 seconds, what that's going to do is allow the weaker fibers in the actual collagen or soft tissue to get stressed to then remodel. If we do it too short, it's not going to stress those weaker areas, and you're just going to keep having issues. Increasing tendon compliance. So hypothetically, you're making tendons a little bit less stiff, closer to the muscle or on the bone to tendon. Yeah, you're still making that still pretty stiff. Two different types that we'll talk about. Yielding, that is essentially just a force position. You're holding force in a position. So it's trying to force you into a lengthening position or an eccentric, and you're resisting that. And where we started with our guys is making sure the intensity was a 7 out of 10. What does that mean? Is it's got to challenge them enough. And that's where set 1, it could be a 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10. Set 2, it might go down to a 5 out of 10, just because the brain's trying to understand what's going on. Duration, 30 seconds. We'd always cap it at 30 seconds. We never really went longer than that unless we did EQI, which we'll get into here in a second. Overcoming, that's pushing against a non-movable object for anywhere from 3 to 5 seconds, different amounts of sets. Eccentrics, that's increasing our force attenuating properties and capabilities. It's increasing our tissue remodeling, just ripping those soft tissues apart. Increasing our tendon compliance. So it's making it a little bit less stiff. But like I said, it's still making it stiff bone to tendon, whereas tendon to muscle, it's just stretching it and making it a little bit less compliant. Two types we used, it's eccentric, quasi-isometric. So it's an EQI, that's actually coming off of Dustin Aronchik's work I think he's out of Australia, but he looked at EQIs, that's essentially taking a movement and you have 45 seconds where you're going through the full range of motion. And what that's going to do is now increase the impulse at every degree of range of motion of the muscle. So it's pretty taxing, but it's also very good for remodeling. And I'm smiling because our guys hated it, but loved it. The next piece was super maximal eccentrics. So that's working at anywhere from 105 to 140% of 1RM of their concentric. So that's where we used a lot. Hatfield versions where we're overloading the eccentric and guys are pulling out of the hole. Fast eccentrics, it's increasing the reflexive coordination, just because time is a constraint, and that's now we're getting into the motor learning aspect where they're going to resort back to the strategy. They're going to accomplish the same task, it's just with what strategy. And increasing limb velocities and increasing our eccentric induced muscle damage. It's decreasing our tendon compliance, making it more stiff, increasing braking forces. And the fast eccentrics, it was anywhere from 50 to 30% 1 RM of the concentric action. And the duration was trying to be under less than 1 second. Last piece, dynamic, is increasing the reflexive coordination, increasing limb velocities. It's decreasing the tendon compliance, was making the tendon really stiff, which is good. It's increasing the braking forces as well. And the type is a plyometric. So it's your normal just plyometric you would see, and then even into an assisted version. So we're trying to keep that time constraint less than 1 second. So it's max effort. You know, all this is max effort. It's just a matter of what's being played on top of our axial skeleton to slow us down. This is just looking at a zoomed out approach, putting it all together. All right, now we're getting into actual what the exercises might look like and how we actually go into the contraction progression here. And so depending on where we were in the rehab return to play process, it might be just isometrics, and then we will get into adding layers of eccentric, fast eccentric dynamics, which we'll show here in a second, the actual timeline. But here's a version of just a yielding hip thrust. And this is just me getting in position. This is 125 kilos on the bar, and you're just trying to get up into the top range, end range of motion, making sure those glutes are squeezing. And this is glutes shortening at the very top. And the weight you're thinking is just trying to force you down, and you're resisting that motion. So that's held for 30 seconds. And then I'll just rack it again. This is now getting into a super maximal or maximal eccentric. This is on a 5 count lower. And as you can see, he has hands on the handle, and we try to coach them, hey, 1 to 2 fingers on the handles only, and then pull yourself out of the hole. Getting into the fast eccentrics, to give you an idea what that looked like. This is a movement that is high intentions. Now, as you can see, it looks like just a forward lunge. I'm actually dropping the weights. The weights are becoming weightless, and then I'm grabbing in the very bottom. So why that's important is because that's going to have implications on the tendon. That's increasing the jerk acceleration on the tendon. As you can see, I almost fell over. So once again, it looks like a forward lunge, but I'm actually lunging into it, letting go of the weights, and then grabbing the weights in the very bottom of my split squat position. And then dynamic, we all know what that is. That's just sprinting, jumping, changing directions at a very high rate with no external load. Progression, first we started with is distal to proximal. So we always started with the endpoints, and that's mainly our ankle that we dealt with these guys, looking at the big toe, and looking at flexion extension of the big toe, flexion extension of the ankle. And so that's going to go into then our progression that we used of movement patterns. We started with prone, supine, seated. So that was versions of those guys at a very early stage, sitting on a bench with their legs straight, doing just plantar flexion and holding for 30 seconds. And then the next day they'd come in, we'd sit them down, they put their legs on the ground, so their knees are bent at 90. They'd go into a knee bent plantar flexion. So it's stressing the gastroc and the soleus very differently. Half kneeling to quadruped. That's the next progression that we used with the guys once they became more proficient and got cleared to do certain things. And then it was standing unloaded, which we weren't there very long because by then we've already laid the groundwork of getting the actual soft tissue stronger, getting the neuromechanical process better and stronger and more resilient and more robust. And then that went into just standing or quadruped external loading, mainly for those guys that was standing with load. That was doing loaded plantar flexion with knee extension or loaded plantar flexion with knee flexion. Pain scale that we paid attention to with our med staff and our athletic trainers and ourselves is if pain started to escalate above a certain threshold, we just knew that if it got above a 5, that they should go see the athletic trainers. Something that was pretty cool is we never actually had that happen. These guys went through the whole process, 6 months, no setbacks, never had to stop a lift. So that's really important, and it was really cool to see. And that's one of the things that we're most proud about. Now we're putting it all together. So this is essentially just a framework of kind of how to get the exercises rolling and how you go about it. And as we can just see here, I'm not going to stay on this too long, but everything went from left to right, and just pay attention to, it was everything we just talked about, except now it's just putting in a framework of what the characteristics or the traits we're after. In a sense, is it more muscle driven, or is it more tendon driven, or both? I know both are at play. It's just, that's a very simplistic approach, in a sense, like, is it a muscle strain or is it a tendon rupture? And that'll kind of give you an idea where to start. And with these guys, they start with isometrics. Now is to remodel the actual tendon through the stress relaxation process we just talked about. And that was big for us. We did a lot more yielding than isos. Yielding, as you can see, at 75 to 150% body weight at 30 seconds. And then on field, trying to match up just the actual traits that we're after and characteristics. So if it's a high force, stay in the weight room. And as they got running on the field, it's going to be a high force. And then vice versa, if it's in the weight room, it's say more like a higher speed, which we did all of the things I just mentioned. But if we're overloading the speed in the weight room, it'd be overloading the speed on the actual turf. And this will be talked about even more, and just through the timeline that we're going to go through in a second. But this is just more or less how everything comes together. And now we're going to just see how we did it from a timeline standpoint, and how we talked about all those progressions on a timeline standpoint, and how we use the 1080 on a timeline standpoint. And then we have videos with it, and we show the progress that they're making. And then we have all of their results to kind of have a zoomed out approach, which is laying all this down right now. That's the framework to how we navigated this problem. All right, getting into the timeline. So going back, April, surgery. It was about 3 weeks into April, I think, when both those guys had surgery. So this will take us through a timeline, and then the progressions. That's the progressions that we just talked about. That's the movement progressions that we went through, movement pattern wise, but also too the weight room progressions. So like actual contraction progression. So that's isos, eccentrics, all the way down into our dynamics, and when we kind of push those buttons, and then kind of where they are at along that timeline, and then getting into just sprinting and really high velocity movements. So from surgery to May, this is the process that we used, mainly hung around just prone, supine, and seated. And the two actual like muscle contractions that we were after were yielding isos, and then EQI and eccentrics. And so we were making sure that one, soft tissue is getting rebuilt, remodeled, but also two, the neural capacity was increasing. So that's the neural drive. So that's why we hung around with these two, mainly isometrics. And then as they got a little more proficient, we started tipping the stress into more EQI and eccentrics. But these two were laying the groundwork for everything we did. That was everything from our ankle plantar flexion, dorsiflexion type work, into leg extensions at 0 degrees and 90 degrees, into prone hamstring curl, 90-degree holds, and even deep flexion hamstring holds. Now we're going to move into the next phase of late July. So May, June, and July is essentially we laid down 3 months of groundwork of making sure soft tissue is getting prepared, the actual nervous system is being prepared and actually exposed to higher forces with low limb speeds, just to make sure we're reducing the risk of injury. But also too, kind of we just talked about, it's attacking the tendon and it's attacking the soft tissue. We're making the tendon a little bit more compliant, less stiff, and we're making sure we're remodeling the cross-sectional area of the actual muscle. So then we migrated into prone, supine, and half kneeling. So now we're going to start stressing the big toe a little bit more in certain positions. And then we're going to start loading that. And that's loaded standing. So that's standing plantar flexion with knee extension and knee flexion. We had a pitch arc that we used. And then loaded multi-joint. That's split squat isos and different joint angles and joint actions. So we now have added fast eccentrics. That's still mainly machine-based. We had a hamstring curl and a leg extension machine that we utilized in our warm-up, but also two in our lift. to accomplish that actual task we're after, the fast eccentric component. And so now it's iso yielding, it's eccentric and EQIs, and now fast eccentrics. We got into actual 1080 resisted marching in late July, which will show a video here of what that looked like. And we knew, and we had to make sure that their lower extremities, so the distal endpoints, were able to tolerate what we're going to put them through. And we had a day in and day out process with these guys, with the medical staff, making sure we're asking questions, we're interviewing the actual athletes to make sure, hey, how you feeling? Pain? Yes, no, what's going on? So that was our subjective questionnaire, essentially daily with our guys. July 21st was their first day of loaded marching. So what this is looking at here is this is looking at powers on the y-axis, and then distance is on the x-axis, and this is via 1080. So this is just the 1080 file, and I've just visualized it. And what this did is showing that different colors are denoted to different loads on the 1080. So blue and light blue is less load, whereas dark deep red is more load. That's up to 30 kilos. So the first day of marching, we got up into 20, 25 kilos. And what we started with though is 5, 10, 15, and we realized, hey, that's not enough stimulus for these guys. They actually need more. And so we kept checking in every rep with them. Hey, how you doing? You good? Yep, good. Let's increase it. Cool, awesome. So as we can see here, guys got, close to 600 watts. Okay, decent for first day. We chalked it up as a good win. This is what the marching looked like. This isn't one of the Achilles guys just on the same page, but this was an example of what it looks like. Now we're actually getting into what it looked like 1080 version. And so we can look at left and right. And we did this with our guys. We had to make sure we took notes of which leg was forward, so then we could go in and show left versus right. Are they making change with force per limb? And also too, looking at the slopes and peaks of these lines, what's going on? And that's kind of how we directed it early on. And as we can see by these lines, the right is left, the green is right. So left, red, green, right. And as we can just see where these peaks look different, yeah, it's the red, and the red doesn't have the slope that the green does. So that's the injured limb. And so that's how we used it, is that we would mark this every single time that they went to see what's the change taking place. And we can also see how fast change it takes place. But what we look at here is this athlete number 1, who was the mid-tendon guy. He's averaging about 400 watts and, 400 newtons and about 1.3 meters per second in speed. So that's pretty slow for a march, but that's day 1. He had a 7% difference in newtons force left to right. Athlete 2, same thing, where the injured limb is the right, and then the left is, the injured side is the left and the non-injured side is the right. And so what we can just see here is, once again, the slopes and the peaks, very different. And we can see the non-injured limb versus the injured limb and what's going on. And it's squiggly because velocity is a linear process, right? It's straight ahead, direction derived. And so is there something happening where it's the 1080 is like wobbling? We don't know. But at the end of the day, we'll see here in a second how well these get cleaned up. And so he's at about 428 newtons average and about 1.23 meters per second speed. And he's at an 8% difference in force. Okay, 7 days later, peaks look different. This is athlete 1 again. So the peaks are getting taller, the slope's getting more straight up. It's not as flat. And left versus right is looking like they're less asymmetrical. They're becoming more symmetrical from a force standpoint, but also a speed standpoint. Everything's starting to go up. This is only 7 days later. This is at the end of July. So that was July 21st, this is July 28th. And so what we're seeing here is how fast this change can take place. But we got to make sure that the soft tissue is prepared for it and the brain's prepared for this. And that's where all the groundwork, 2.5 months prior was laid. And so we can see now his force is at 471 newtons average and 1.88 meters per second speed. So everything's going up, and his only about a 6% difference in force. Athlete 2, still having some issues early on in their run. And as we can see that by the red, just the peak's a little bit lower, but as he gets going, as a whole, the peaks are getting taller, the slope's getting steeper. So he's having a greater return on investment with what we're doing with him, but also too, his motor learning process is picking up. He's getting better at it. So he's now almost at 2 meters per second. He's at 468 average newtons across the run, or what he was doing, marching essentially. And he's at 11% difference left to right. Now we're getting into August. So now we're right around the halfway mark. So that's right around 3 months. And now we're migrating into half kneeling, mainly with loaded standing and loaded multi-joint. So we've gone from stressing the tissue in different positions, seated, prone, supine, and we still did that in part of our warm-up, but now we're getting into more standing postures, half kneeling postures to stress the big toe still and flexion extension. And now we've added another piece of a 1080 drill wise. So we were doing resisted marching, and now we're getting into resisted marching and now resisted linear and lateral movements. And so we'll get into what took place there. We'll show you some videos as well. But these guys essentially want to start running earlier on than we allowed them to. And so what we'll see here in a second is how their force and their power and their speed all went through the roof here shortly. August 8th. So as we saw, July 21st, they were at about, 600 watts, and now they're getting over 2000 watts. So as we can see here, we've also changed our load. We've gone heavy. So we've gone heavier now to slow down their limb speeds, kind of what we just talked about. Why we did that is risk of injury, getting them stronger, more force driven, slowing down their limb speeds. It's not going to expose the soft tissue to these giant range of motions at high limb speeds. So it's just hedging our risk with injury, but also too, we're stressing the distal properties. So that's the Achilles, the gastroc with more load. This is one of the Achilles guys. 30 kilos. So gear 2. And now we're seeing a difference in peaks. We're seeing a difference in slope. We're seeing a difference in everything. So their force went up. Now we're at 528. Sorry, 526. And now we're at 4.48 meters per second velocity. So big difference. Essentially almost 4x their speed and their their force in about 3 weeks. We're seeing about a 4% difference now. So that's really important to know that these peaks are almost symmetrical now, left to right. And this is how we used it. This is knowledge of performance. We'd flip it around and show our guys too as they were running, because they wanted to know, how am I doing? Is it getting better? And that's how we coached them essentially. And myself and Aaron used it as a coaching tool, and we would adjust their angles, play with them, work on their kinematics, and resisted sprinting can definitely change those with less coaching cues. Athlete 2, same thing. So the force has gone up, 559. It's a peak. Sorry, I might have said a few slides earlier, average. The newtons I'm spitting out right now is peak. So that's 559. Velocity is at 4.27. That's a peak as well. So why I'm saying this is because they were 4xing essentially their force, their speed, and everything in 3 weeks. That's not because of us. That's essentially because what the athletes put in. We are there to help them through the process. We put together this framework. That framework was laying the groundwork early on. And so now they're just realizing their new strength, their new power, their new velocity that they're being exposed to coming off an injury. This is lateral. So this is later August. This is what we started to do to stress the different types of joint actions, but also to the tissue differently in a sense, rotational aspect of the gastroc, the Achilles. This is going to get more hip as opposed to more quad load. So we'd make sure that we didn't just overload one area too long. We did linear and lateral. So day A would be linear, day B would be lateral. And we just did that repeatedly. And that's the frequency aspect. That's gear 2. That's 30 kilos lateral. So pretty important to know that we did linear and lateral. And this was more or less, we understood like what they're prepared for. We talked with the trainers. The way they cleared that was making sure that they could do 20 calf raises essentially, and that there wasn't a drop off, but also too, we videoed it and got joint angles and making sure that they were above a certain degree of plantar flexion. So there was a process here. These guys were chomping at the bit, and we actually had to hold them back a little bit. But so this is now just showing how the groundwork early on led to this. September. Now we're getting into purely just loaded multi-joint movements. So now it looks more like a normal lift. So it's going to be, you know, anywhere from a split squat iso to eccentric split squat to a fast eccentric split squat to a split jump. And we kind of just stayed along this, and we just added more as we got going here. So now we're adding that last piece is dynamic, and that's going to be the very, 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 very high velocity type movements, even into assisted movements. And so as we can see here with the 1080, we did resisted and now assisted lateral and linear movements. And now we're getting into sprinting and then repeat sprintability and change of direction. So why we're getting into this is because we saw the progression these guys were making. We kept tabs on them. We did a lot of just monitoring of them. And every 2 weeks we tested them in certain things to make sure that they're making progress, but also too, to show them progress. And the last piece is the medical staff kept asking questions too. Hey, just keep us in the loop. We were meeting them daily, telling what's going on. So once again, it's a very holistic process here. This is showing September 1st. Okay, so that's less than 4 weeks from what I just showed you. That was August 8th, this is September 1st, and now they're at 2,500 watts. And that's within 10 meters. So they're throwing out some serious watts right now. That's at 30 kilos. So as you can see, we hung around 30 kilos for a pretty long time. There was a point in time that we did get into some load velocity profile and some lighter loads, which I'll show you here in a second. But at the end of the day, we got to make sure that these dudes' force capabilities were through the roof, and that was distal to proximal. And I think we were achieving that with everything we did in the weight room, but also too on field. This is an example of an assisted. So the 1080 now is pulling the athlete into the movement, and we use this at the very last layer to get them ready for the demands of football, but also to the demands of sprinting. Just because we saw, you know, that's maybe where they'd get hurt again. And so we had to make sure we were just bulletproofing this athlete. Talking about the tendons early on, making sure they can actually be stiff and strong and got a bigger cross-sectional area, but also too, they could actually transmit forces very quickly. So this athlete, it'll show you here in a second. So he weighs 265 and he was getting pulled right around 22 miles an hour. So why that's important too is because that's right around 130% of his true max velocity. And he was fine, no problem. Kinematics didn't break down. We'd film it, making sure that he wasn't having any breakdowns along the way, but also too, we check in every single time they did overspeed with us. It was just, hey, how you doing? How's the hamstrings? How's the ankle? How's the Achilles? Good, good, good. Awesome. October, first game. So it was to date, 6 months to date from surgery to their first game. Both these guys played. It was a great day for all of us involved. And it was pretty cool to watch because they both had an impact. And these are players that helped us win games. And so we weren't trying to expedite the process because of that. But at the end of the day, we got them back in 6 months because of the groundwork that we laid, the frequency that we laid, the force that these dudes were able to throw out because their neuromechanical system was supercharged. Their capacities exceeded their previous capacities, and that was them healthy. So we'll show October 7th. Now you're hitting almost 3,000 watts in about 10 meters. So these guys are now throwing out some serious force and speed together, very vicious actions with 30 kilos. It was pretty fun to watch. And so what we're just looking at with these graphs is just these giant spikes, and that's essentially when their foot's on the ground, they're just pushing, and that's when the 1080 gets yanked, and these guys had some serious power. This is the flipping it now. So now this is the overspeed. So the way to look at this is the very left is the start where they're getting pulled. And now as they're getting running, these giant peaks is where they're actually hitting the ground and it's pulling them. And as you can see, the peaks are looking very similar. So the legs of the actual trace are looking very similar. There's no asymmetrical patterns going on here. And so it was over 20 meters that they would do it. So it's pulling them and it would pull them for 20 and then it would just stop with the resistance and slack and they'd keep going. But at the end of the day, this is at assisted 10 kilos. It's a fair amount of yank. And so that's about 140, 135% of this guy's true max velocity. And we'll show how much more they exceeded their previous capacities here in a second. I apologize. I think there's something playing in the background, but so this is the last kind of like zoomed out, looking at all the 1080 data that we did. This is now just linear. So this is taking out all the change of direction. This is taking out the assisted. And we just wanted to visualize each and every time they came in and did the 1080 with us. That's what these dates are denoting at the top of each of this box. And the way to look at this box is the y-axis is the power. The x-axis is the speed in meters per second. And so what we can look at is, one, the color is denoting to the load. So that's the 1080 resistance. Red is 30, blue is 5 or less, essentially. So lighter blue is you're getting into less load. So it's going heavy to light. And so we can see there's a lot of red on here, and that's just showing how much we hung around 30 kilos for a long time with our guys. And you can see the frequency that we did it with them, just looking at the dates. But also too, how thick these slopes are is just volume, is essentially how much volume we did with them. So you can see what we did with volume wise, frequency wise, just doing almost just like 1 run, 2 runs and calling it a day just to keep that neural quality. And far left box is day 1 on 1080, which we just went through. And so as we can see, their power is like right around 500, not a lot. And their speed is less than 2 meters per second. So that's important to know, because as we got going here, each and every time they came in, look at the progress they made in a sense. Look at the slope, look how high that red line's going, and look how much power they're able to produce. And so we can also see where we did our load velocity profiling, or where we did our lighter resistance runs to see just, hey, how can they tolerate that neural trait or quality that we're exposing them to. And we can see down here, the third. So the third is when we did our load velocity profile, and that's when they hit, it was like 8.49 meters per second. And then we did it again the 17th, and then we kind of got away from it and we did just a lighter run on the 6th. But as we were getting close to them playing, we wanted to make sure that they had the force capabilities. Force was the big thing that we worried about. So that's just a zoomed out approach of how frequent we did it, how powerful they became, and how soon we saw these changes happen, just from a neural traits perspective of how much force and velocity they could do together to just express that on the 1080. Now we're getting into just our results, which this is going to wrap everything up. Looking at the results, we did use the Nord board, which I didn't talk about, but we used it essentially two times a month just to tap into, hey, okay, what's happening left to right from the hamstrings or posterior chain, but also looking at it from an RFD standpoint. So it's max RFD. So the time they pulled to the time of the peak, how long did that take, but also what was the force component of that. And so we can see pre-injury to after they went through this whole factory of us, which we call the beast factory, getting these guys primed and ready. And so we saw big time changes. So this is athlete 1. This is the mid tendon rupture guy. He had a 17% change just in the left leg and max force capabilities. The right, he didn't really see much change, but he became a little bit more symmetrical and powerful with both limbs now, which is important. Max RFD in milliseconds, he shaved off about 5%, so he could pull harder and faster. That's a neural trait we wanted. Looking at the sprint, We just capped it at 30 kilos, 10 yards. What was that max value? 2293. And then the force left and right during that run, 500 newtons, almost symmetrical. Max velocity on GPS, he was an 18.1 miles per hour guy, and he got up into 18.91, almost 19 miles an hour, weighing 240 pounds. So we increased his speed, we increased his force capability, we decreased the rate of him of achieving that force, and we broke this into like kind of categories. So the next piece is looking at just strength, which is split squat. So we did 405 for 2 reps on each leg. So 4 total reps. He probably could have done more, but this is a guy that's almost doubling his body weight in split squat per leg. Repeat sprint ability, repeat sprint ability. This was just looking at game demands that we had. We used Catapult and we looked at GPS. So we looked at distance traveled by his position and him individually, and we wanted to get close to where he was or exceed it, and this guy did. He exceeded it by 36%. Athlete 2 saw very similar things take place here. So max force in the left went up 12%, and the right 112%. Milliseconds decreased by 55. So this guy, his ability to call upon his strength and his force was massive. He could do it really quickly now. And his 1080 sprint data, looking at acceleration power, 10 yards, 30 kilos, in watts, 2360. And looking at left versus right, max force, 539, 488 newtons. So not quite as symmetrical, but made some really, really, really good headway here. It's less than 9% difference. Max velocity, he was an 18-mile-an-hour guy, and he got up into 1904. So that's an 8% change in max velocity. This is him setting a new PR. The other guy as well was a new PR, as we can see. That was their highest ever they've hit with us, coming off of what we put them through. Split squat, 405 for 2 as well, each leg. Repeat sprint ability, I apologize. He didn't get close. He was under about 47%, but we kind of viewed it as, we hedged our risk with the force. Yeah, the repeat spin ability for him as an outside linebacker might not be as important. However, we do want to keep an eye on that. At the end of the day, thank you, everybody. I thank 1080. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Ola, for everything you guys have done and helped me along this way. But hopefully this gave you guys some good material. Feel free to ask any questions, and I appreciate it.